If you're just joining us, we are glad to have you on board. It's the Kickstarter, and we are discussing Western geopolitical influence on Africa in light of the latest developments that see a wave of sanctions that have been rolled out affecting politicians in the country. I'll be introducing my guests very shortly, but before I do that, let's have a preamble on the post-colonial political systems in Africa and the continent's external influences, especially when it comes to democratization. The continent has become one of the theaters for the powers play between expansionist China, a more assertive Russia, and to a lesser extent a traditional Europe and the United States, whilst other countries like Turkey are successfully increasing their footprint on the continent. The last decade and a half in Africa's recent history has been marked by some dramatic and significant developments, especially in the political terrain. These developments have been as varied as they have been contradictory. They have also constituted a major source of challenges to political theories as different schools of thought grapple, especially coming to terms with the weight and meaning of influences from Washington, London, Beijing. The latest rollout of sanctions against the Speaker of Uganda's parliament has, of course, drawn attention to the tools available to the international community to rein in on officials in third world countries that they assume or believe are corrupt and need to be brought to book. I have with me Marion Kirabo, a lawyer and political analyst, joining me for this discussion. Looking forward to your perspective. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
How are you doing?
I'm fine. Thank you.
On my extreme left, I have Timothy Chemonges, also a political analyst and a usual suspect. Many thanks for joining us. We shall also be speaking later to Fred Mukasa Mbidde. He's the Vice President of the Democratic Party. First and foremost, my preamble about Western geopolitical influences in Africa. We shall be delving into exactly what creates the need for this conversation today. The developments that see banks sharing information and advising each other on how to go about transactions that may involve those that have been listed as sanctioned. But when it comes to Western influence on Africa, to continue to talk about it might sound like a broken record. Yeah. But every day, whatever happens on the continent, be it in the political, economic, social sphere, is heavily influenced by what's happening in the Western world. Let me begin with the lady. What's your take on the latest developments across board that we find ourselves, well, proxies, as we've always been, but most importantly, others will look at them as more strategic pointers of where we are going in terms of the battles between the United States and China?
So, in terms of sanctions, I think right now we are seeing a fight between, I would call them the big lions on the international space, China and America, trying to fight for influence over the world's economies. And America, in attempts to keep its economic power right now, as it has always done in the past, using economic sanctions as a kind of tool, a kind of soft power. You know, back in the days it was military might, but now as we have realized with many countries stocking up on their nuclear weapons, at least the world is on the same page that we can no longer use military might, you know, right from World War II. Yes, you might get more than you bargained for. So then the next best thing becomes economic sanctions, and the US is quite notorious from this. Take for example, we see like the bans on Chinese companies like how do they pronounce it? The phone company Huawei, and
Huawei.
Then Hawaii. Yes, that one. But then also the current ban on TikTok. So you see America trying to make sure that it protects its business as much as possible against China. so that it can maintain its power. And it's because the US has this economic system that it works under and has so many allies. You also see that in turn also relates to how its allies will then interact with China. You will see the UK trying to ban TikTok on some of its government officials. You will also see countries like in the EU trying to make sure that they limit their officials from using these Chinese apps. So in these economic sanctions, even beyond Anita Amongi, we are seeing the West continually using economic sanctions to kind and pursue its interests, whether it's in democracy, whether it's in interests of making sure that its economic strength is maintained. So it's a bigger topic.
All right, we shall attempt to, of course, point it towards what this means for Uganda in particular. But on the political front, let me just, of course, I don't know how to put this particular question, but there's a strong notion that has been birthed within European colonial powers that either Africa has been abandoned and others continue to treat us in a paternalistic way. The US and Europe attempt to nudge our governance issues and then look at our politicians. Are they doing the right thing? Are they in line? For us, what we see, when they are in line with their interests, very little happens in terms of sanctions or any measures that are designed to either curtail them. When they are not supporting their interests, all of a sudden, the whip is so hard on them. And this, of course, came in light of the anti-homosexuality bill and things like that. The speaker has been has evidently used it too, and she says this is all down to that. But corruption is something that is real. Is the West trying to tell African politicians that we are tired of theft, yet it goes behind and still serves the grants and all these other monies that come to us?
Yeah, so I think that if looking at how sanctions look like, the nature, but also what surrounds sanctions, it's primarily premised on influence. Influence, access to power and resources. Two is that sanctions are not legal in nature. They're simply diplomatic measures that countries use, to send a message. And they need not to be in line of what you wish to be. And to the extent that a country or a nation or a setting can use these sanctions to its interest as a country or to the interest of the bigger goal of the aspirations that are being pushed by the global move. I think that it's to the extent of your ability to influence. I can tell you for a fact, if the African countries had the capacity and the position to actually sanction countries, they would actually use it to their advantage. It's just that, unfortunately, that we, as African countries, despite our strong desire and the push for sovereignty, we say we are sovereign countries, we do not have the capacity. Our economic influence does not allow us to put in place these sanctions.
Throwing around sanctions.
Otherwise would many of these countries looking at our setting would have used it to our advantage. And so I think that to the extent that as African countries, we've continued to position ourselves as beneficiaries of the global benefits, to aid, to trade, we find ourselves definitely in a disadvantaged positions where we cannot work without some of these countries. And so it's just to say that the West will continue to use these influences. But I think it's to where we find ourselves as Africa is how best can we get out of this situation. But also more importantly is to say that we've seen sanctions put in many of these countries and some of the individuals, and some of the countries have found a way out of this dilemma of being sanctioned. Yeah, and so definitely there's a component of the power of some of these big powers, China, UK, America, Russia now coming on board, trying to also find a space in the whole space. But it's to the extent of how much can you utilize your influence, your resources, but more importantly, what is within your reach that the other countries do not have. You've seen that as specifically for us as a country, we've continued to position ourselves for aid, and we cannot survive partly without aid, which is a good carrot that most of these countries use to to direct us and push their agenda. Yeah. All
right. Let me ask the question of hypocrisy, and one would wonder, either I'm being dismissive, but I know, and we've covered many stories where we would expect the West to act, and the West has not acted. And then all of a sudden we have a piece of legislation, the Global Anti-Corruption Sanctions Regime in the UK, being occasioned on Uganda, and the reason that has been put forth is the iron sheets. When we look at the trajectory of scandal in this country, and then the UK tells us that it is on iron sheets where they drew the line, it is a bit disturbing, isn't it? Shouldn't the UK be disturbed more by other aspects and scandals even before the iron sheets issue came about? What could be the issue with iron sheets anyway?
I think that might be a very simplistic way to view the topic. At the end of the day, even when the UK and America, or whatever Western power it is, have the economic strength to actually impose these sanctions, they work in a global economy, they work with sovereign states. So you can't be seen to poke your nose in each and every affair of a country. That today you're on mabaati, tomorrow you are on let me say, victims of torture. Maybe tomorrow you're on the anti-homosexuality bill, then tomorrow you're talking about the fact that a hospital, money was given for a hospital and that hospital was not constructed. You can't be seen to poke your nose in each and everything. So even when these countries are exercising their economic strength, you choose which words that you can pick and which ones may seem perhaps a little bit politically correct. You know, at the end of the day, the first critics will come to you and be like, but you know, we have sovereignty. Why anti-corruption is perhaps an easier route to take is because right now at the international stage, there's this fight against money laundering, you know. So the anti-corruption rules, the anti-corruption global regulations really are something that is easy for everyone to understand. You know, here we're fighting corruption, just like anti-terrorism was during the Bush administration. You know, there are terrorist attacks, there's a growing threat of terrorist attacks, and therefore we need you guys to allow us to sanction this, sanction Iraq, sanction the Taliban, let's sanction this and this and this. And a lot of people did not bat an eye because of 11 September, what happened with the bombings in America. So even when they are using this economic sanction, they need to look at the politics of it. You don't just go into a country and start imposing everything. But it's also not true that it's only anti-corruption that the West has imposed sanctions. We remember the sanctions against Kale Kaihura and the reasons that they gave, including the fact that they found him in violation of human rights and the torture during his time as in charge of the police, how they found him abusing a lot of human rights, you know. So it's also not true that it has only been corruption scandals that have been sanctioned against. But the politics still remains is that countries, at least on the face of it, are sovereign, you know, and so you can't interfere. But also, I will say, if you're taking money from someone, you know, we are receiving grants up to 15 million money in climate change activism, and you're receiving 76 billion from a country, and they are seeing you squandering it on. Don't you think there has to be a legitimate concern of how you're spending?
And that is where I want to point our direction, especially when it comes to the international community seems to be kind of in a spot of bother. They have a structure or a way of doing business with African countries that cannot allow for a stoppage. It has to continue because it works for everybody. It works for them, it works for African despots and many people who are involved in mal-governance, if that is any word to choose to use. Have they run out of options to the extent that now running for small sanctions on is something they can pull? Can the IMF, can the World Bank also come up and pull some of these moves? Of course, we saw the anti-homosexuality issue, the World Bank came straight on it. But I'm trying to understand why the UK specifically chose iron sheets and not anti-homosexuality, because I would expect that to be the most available option to take.
So I think, again, it is to understand the nature of these sanctions. So they are political in nature.
Yeah, very political, no doubt.
And the choice of how I sanction you or the item I choose to sanction on you is primarily on my decision. And it's also to the extent that there are low-hanging fruits, which one can easily make sense or resonate to the people within a country.
Okay.
The anti-homosexuality law substantially, and my guess would be that this is an item that has substantially been explored, and the global practitioners have made their case. And so, looking at the corruption, it's true, and you know, there are many questions. Would be, okay, why would you only choose 3 people? Why would you? And yet we have many people. We are facing a lot of challenges. Why did you only specifically choose that? I think for me is on the low-hanging fruit, to the extent that the target of these sanctions is very clear, and that was the person of the speaker. Now, my assessment again is that the 2 individuals that were sanctioned together with the speaker, these were sort of conduits.
Maria Goretti Kitutu,
yes.
And Agnes Nandutu.
And Agnes Nandutu. These were to cover up and provide a space where, you know, the main target is not very clear. And so looking at that specific is to see that there's a lot of impunity in this country. Right from corruption, but also how we deal with our resources. So our focus should be on the bigger picture.
And which is that?
Which is the nature and governance issues that we face in this country. So it's the message is very clear to all of us that as a global stakeholders, we are watching you. And this is to the extent that if you go against some of the things that we don't agree on, we shall put a sanction on you. We've seen other countries and institutions such as UAE now coming on board. The reports are that the speaker now has been sanctioned by, you know,
the region in
UAE. That's the United.
That is really significant because many of the politicians here do that about Uganda, Dubai and stuff like that. Yeah, that is really significant.
Absolutely, and so again is to see, for example, the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. When the bank goes ahead to put sanctions on you, if you look at their legal framework, it's very clear in terms of how actually a bank can eventually come and put sanctions on you. that must be approved by the government. That's the cabinet of UAE. So you see that it has a ripple effect, and there seems to be a very clear direction. And to the extent that other players, now you have UK, and then you have now the United Arab Emirates coming on board on the same reasons of corruption. The next
there's already the existing Magnitsky sanctions. So
it's also to the extent that, you know, corruption is very elusive. Sometimes putting a hand on it is very hard, especially on the political players. They are very smart to ensure that they are not in the whole space. And so finding something that you can easily cling on becomes a bit harder. And for us, you know, we may end up saying, why would it be just the mabaati? Could it be there is a bigger, the other, other? But as a country, it is true that abuse of resources, abuse of power, and the impunity that we still continue to see in our governance system is very clear. And so this is a very clear message to our leaders and those that are in charge of our country.
The president has been very laid back, and I haven't had a statement that should be his reaction to this. But we also remember that when Sam Kutesa was sanctioned, it took time for him to come out and talk about it, and then he continued to work very well with Mr. Sam Kutesa, and of course investing all the trust in him. I do not know how it's going to work out this time with the speaker, Anita Among, but if the events in Kabaramaido the other day at the launch of the comprehensive school and all these institutions is anything to go by, we expect the president to come in full support of Anita Among, or am I wrong on that?
No, you're not wrong. Like you've said, given what we saw with Sam Kutesa, perhaps we might see the same chain of events playing out. But also with Sam Kutesa, it was quite tough. Reports, at least the reports around that time, were that he was Minister of Foreign Affairs, who had travel bans on him, not being able to access his account, a lot of companies not wanting to do business with him.
That's right.
And that became very hard for him to run that ministry. And even with the president trying to hold on, the reports would show you that it was quite hard until he eventually dropped him. So he would fight, because at the end of the day, perhaps some would argue that everything that she does benefit him and his stay in power. But until how long can you deal with someone who is completely isolated by the international community, given the fact that you are a country that is heavily dependent on your international partners, you know, to succeed, to continue to get funding. We saw that, for example, as the Speaker of Parliament, there are some parliamentary engagements that she should be a part of, the Commonwealth Parliamentary.
I mean, at the end of the day, when you see the itinerary of conferences and events that she has to attend in a single year, it means now that has been cut by more than completely. 70%.
So which avenues do you have to advocate for your country as a representative, as a Speaker of the House? When you go there, you can no longer be an ambassador for that country. You can no longer speak to the issues affecting that country, and that becomes you become a liability to the people that you represent, including the state itself. So it might that they will save face for some time, but eventually the sanctions would wear them down. But I think it also brings an important issue about the success of some of these sanctions and the constant criticism that these sanctions actually do little to achieve.
I mean, how effective they can be.
Yes. But I will also say that, you see, targeted sanctions, unlike, let me say, comprehensive sanctions that you levy, are more, let me say, harmful. And like I said, in a country where, in a global economy where we want peace, economic sanctions become the only viable weapon that we have to achieve some of these things.
Maybe just also,
can you use a minute? Because I need to go into a break.
Absolutely.
And then we have something on the ground that we need to update ourselves on how it's going.
Absolutely. So just on President Museveni and whether he can...
His reaction, or his lack of
Absolutely. So I think beyond, President Museveni is a politician. And the bottom line in politics is interest.
In fact, he's a political scientist.
He's a political scientist and a master at that. And understanding that interest is the primary currency. That is, and this is just not a Ugandan thing, it's a global thing. He has also to calculate and see his ability to some of these sanctions and how it may affect him. So that's something that you will have to calculate, and it's something that has to be handled very well. And so he may not easily jump. And to the extent that it's going to affect him at a global stage, actually we'll choose to just leave it for Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
We shall be digging a little bit deeper into that ground so that we can understand how this is going to affect the president, affect the country, but also the targets of these particular sanctions. Somebody was telling me that if the accounts of the speaker are, she's not allowed to make transactions at any one point, the husband might want to travel to conduct matters football for the country, and that could affect him. So our football could also be affected as a result of the speaker being sanctioned by the UK. Interesting politics. When we return, we shall be delving a lot more into this topic. But I've already cautioned him on using English large. He will be moderating, and he will be moderate rather in his employ. Many thanks for joining us, Honourable Mukasa Mbidde, for this morning's discussion.
Thank you, my brother. I also greet you, colleagues.
For purposes of continuing your namesake's conversation, you must have arrived in an SUV. Not so? But anyway.
It's all about choices.
Choices,
when you ask an astronaut how he went
to the moon, obviously, it will not be pompous when he tells you he actually went with the rocket. That is the best means. All right. These are just tools of trade, and it doesn't matter how much it costs. What actually matters is how you obtained the capacity to buy it, why you bought it, and whether it serves the purpose, in my opinion. Okay. Yes. All right. Let's go into the issues of this morning's discussion, the sanctions against the speaker and how that puts Uganda, especially when it comes to the strategic endgame on the international stage. I've asked Ms. Kirabo and Mr. Chemonges, and they've been ably taking us through what this means, the implications at individual level, but also for the country. And we were trying to understand whether President Yoweri Museveni might use this particular development to begin to shape a new political inclination ahead of 2026. We saw how he dealt with Sam Kutesa. Maybe he might deal with this particular development the same way, but he's a man who you have to wait until you hear his word, and then you know exactly what he is thinking. What do you make of the latest developments regarding the slapping of sanctions against the speaker by the UK? And the two former ministers. Well, first of all, that it's an issue that I personally consider extremely huge. I have also heard the politicians glossing over the effect of such sanctions as if they are talking about an ordinary individual. The peremptory nature of the work of a Speaker of the House requires, of course, a multiplicity of trips and dealings. That's right. With the international world. And when you obtain such sanctions on an individual basis, by the way, of course, that establishes the kind of clogs, the blockades, the fanfaronnades against you to proceed properly in the service of the duty for which you were elected. Others have also been arguing matters and material to do with the sovereignty of Uganda. But you see, Uganda is one country that is where you will shudder at the kind of things that we do. When you look at our constitution, for example, of course, as amended, Article 8, capital A, it stresses that Uganda shall be run, of course, purposely. Obviously, we know that national objectives and objective principles of state policy are part of the Constitution.
of Uganda, according to that amendment. Now, that being the case, Objective 28 also stresses respect for treaty obligations. Now we have a country that enters into treaties, agreements, and bilaterals where obligations under our substantive principles are supposed to be followed. You are surrendering part of your sovereignty for the achievement of the same. Now, you cannot turn around and urge sovereignty as a defense. I have been having problems with the attorneys general of several countries before the East African Court of Justice, where they think that sovereignty is a defense. But appending a signature to a treaty is itself an act of sovereignty. So you are handing over parts of sovereignty to the achievement of the objects for which the treaty has been enacted. So what are we looking at? What are the commitments that the country has made for purposes of accessing aid from several countries? When you look at the, for example, the AAA, the Accra Agenda for Action, where the commitment for accountability was accompanied by Britain's support for 50% grants and all for purposes of facilitating now such grants through direct financial systems of the countries. Now when you look at, because Britain is now almost the 4th largest donor to Uganda, of course in addition to the World Bank, then you look at the African Development Bank, then United States. Now that means that we have got commitments, and the commitments are majorly two: financial accountability and human rights. Now, definitely when you look at the sanctions regime and the objects for which they were established, and I agree with anyone that says these are low-hanging fruits. Because in the venture of human rights, I have looked at several documents, and it looks like the list is going to be larger than what we expect. But, and from several countries, even the United States, and because now when you argue issues to do with LGBTQ, then one would question why. Okay, we are looking at the affected countries, the Republic of South Sudan, we are looking at Maldives, we are looking at South Africa. But South Africa, LGBTQ are walking the length and width of the country uninterrupted. So that wouldn't be the case really. And all of those countries didn't participate in passing our law. And when you look at the regime, and particularly the rules, they were established before this law was passed. But then we are looking at the selective nature in which, obviously, they are not looking at the politically inspired human rights violations. And somebody told me that obviously then you will wait for the list to come in. So these are things that we need to look at. We are looking at, of course, when you look at our legal regime here, the presumption of innocence applies with equal force. But somebody takes a decision and immediately it is implemented, and which looks like a sentence without anyone even heard. The old alteram partem, my colleague will tell you, that before you hear any other party, it is
simplify that for me.
You know, that you do not condemn anybody unheard.
Okay.
Probably there would be answers that would be provided by the people that now are sanctioned. But at the same time then, of course the sanctions regime provides regulations on how the speaker and all those affected should now move. Forget the politics. Move and make sure these are expunged from the records. Otherwise we are not going to have a speaker that practically can perform her duties. Why? Because when you look at how the implementation works, it looks like now we are going to have a speaker that has nothing to do with finances, especially where there is any finances whose origin can be traced to any international spheres. Because you are stopped from dealing with persons that are sanctioned, either directly or even indirectly on financial matters. It does not even matter whether the payments to such persons are authentic, are proper payments. It does not matter. And of course now that has got an effect, which is by infection will touch almost all and the sundry of all dealings. Now this is the speaker who is required to sit amongst, of course, all the other leaders for purposes of debating Uganda's interests. Now if, for example, she is to attend the Interparliamentary Union meeting.
The 67th.
Yes. How would a speaker of that nature attend a meeting that has been facilitated from funds, where Britain stops anybody from dealing with such in terms of any payment. Now, whether there is a direct or indirect payment, whether there is a benefit that is financial, directly or indirectly, you will find that the speaker will not be part of the audience or even part of those that are participating rightfully. So I think there is going to be a very big problem that needs to be handled as quickly as practical, other than dealing with it politically.
How do we move on that, dealing with what appears to be a very complicated scenario? Dubai has also come on board, that is the UAE, and its reason seems to be the fact that since there has been sanctions issued against a person we deal with, then I think we're going to have to come on board. Or do they have any particular aspects they're also up against the speaker?
I think looking at the sanctions, they are largely around the same issue, corruption. But as a way forward...
UAE is concerned about corruption.
Corruption, absolutely.
Okay.
And looking at what are the available options really for us, and which would be as Mbidde says, we need to address this in the soonest time possible, and not allow it to take the political direction where we start seeing the head of state, making comments which also have their own implications. I think the quick ways through diplomatic engagements, really. I think that Uganda must take quick actions to ensure that they engage and see what are the available options. Of course, the other things would be that sometimes the available options for as a result of the way out for this is that you have probably have to institute internal legal processes against some of these individuals, so that then the concerns that have been raised against them, either they are acquitted or they are cleared, which is also a very good direction. The other options that as a country we may have had, maybe through trying to engage our other allies in the global stage to equally come to our attention, or to probably come to our side, so that then we can have a bit of weight. May not be a feasible one, but also that's a long term. The quick ones is to have measures where we can engage diplomatically, because again, this is a diplomatic stage.
It's a diplomatic
whether you are whether you are innocent or otherwise, it is it may not be the core. It's to the extent that we have countries, we have institutions that are displeased with your actions, are displeased with what they deem
wayward,
seem not to be going right with their beliefs and actions, and so to that end is to go and engage and see, okay, what. But also it would be good that the president a bit takes slow action against coming out publicly and making statements which also have a bit of effect. I know, again, as has been substantiated on the question of sovereignty, which again is very elusive. Our sovereignty has a lot of other things that must supplement that. If your sovereignty can easily be compromised, either by the economic functions, but also the bigger picture of your ability to influence things, it becomes a bit of a problem. But also, I think the point is that internally as a country, we may want to relook and see what are the other mechanisms that we may need to put in place to address. Again, it's true that some of these things that are happening, the corruption questions, at least for us, that has been highlighted, the issue of corruption. There are many things, and some of the questions that you were asking earlier on, why is it that the focus is only on corruption? We have human rights issues, we have all the other things, but to the extent of that, I think is to see what are the other internal mechanisms within the country we can institute and put in place to ensure that some of these things can be, going forward, can be looked into, because it affects us as a country, both in terms of how we operate, our governance systems, but also our picture as a country.
But you do understand the people you are hoping to address this issue are the very persons who are targeted. So the aspect of the will to even make things better is suspect. I don't know.
Because like my brother is saying,
how can Uganda indicate to partners on financial matters that it is serious on corruption, for example? Leaving aside, of course, the selection of the items for which they were indicted, but corruption per se. Now, and even specifically when you look at the procedures, because one was saying, but we had not exhausted internal remedies. Others were before courts of law. Why would they then quickly fix people when we are still now ahead of, we are still handling, our judiciary is still handling.
They would have waited for
what are they
courts
doing in the judiciary? Because you see, we have got two major instruments here for the fight against corruption, and as lawyers we know, of course, the Anti-Corruption Act, then we have got the Penal Code Act. Now we know the effect of the trials available right now before courts of law on possession of suspected property. But we know that the penal code was better. It had better placed provisions on, for example, wrongful possession of government stores. Now that would catch very many, but of course the investigators chose to move and charge. These suspects, in my opinion, it was extremely pretentious. When I call it Chichi and Ladida, people think I am just speaking English. But it became pretentious. So when the European powers, the partners on financial matters, feel that actually there is anyway, because suspect property, the defenses can arise in any case. In any case, the Prime Minister's office handles very many. The government stores are wide. They are extremely wide. Anybody can place this before Karamoja, or it could have been under disaster. And that's it, and you have won the case. So in my opinion, Europeans think and feel that probably we don't even see any light at the end of the tunnel for purposes of the current trials. So they feel that actually they must now try these people themselves. Because there are two types of taxpayers here that we are talking about. The Ugandan taxpayer who feels there must be justice. But also the British taxpayers who feel their money should be followed. We must also think about them. So it is not just us. Therefore, the country must be clear on the fight against corruption. Then we will now proceed unconcernedly to redeem our own people where they are being mistreated. For me, that is my take.
Okay, let me ask your fellow lawyer, if the Speaker and all those indicted for the sanctions were to have an opportunity to state their case, which I doubt happens in the sanctions regime, where you have to come and explain yourself about how unfair any one party is in sanctioning you, what would be the line of argument for Speaker Anita Among?
I think that I think that would be.
Would she say, "Do you have evidence?" Until that is provided, then perhaps we can have a conversation.
Perhaps her only defense would be that she was found not having any wrongdoing. There was an investigation, and she was found not having any wrongdoing. However, that, like Honorable Mukasa Mbidde said, that becomes problematic in a country where we are sure, we know that it's a public secret that given her position as Speaker of Parliament, but given her position in Uganda's political hierarchy, there was no way that that process was going to find her guilty. Yes, we all do it, because I mean, if you say that you have not done anything wrong, why return them? But then also, how does property that is supposed to be for a vulnerable group like the Karamoja end up with you? You know, in which capacity did you hold these iron sheets? But also the problematic thing about this whole situation is that with a region that is facing famine and starvation, was it really, I don't understand the logic to say that the most urgent thing to relieve their pain and their starvation would be iron sheets. You get? So that whole the whole situation is quite problematic, I would say. And perhaps I would also agree with Honorable that at the end of the day, when you see no light at the tunnel, and even when we're talking about sovereignty and we're talking about imperialism and the fact that, you know, these sanctions really are tools, an extension of imperialism, sometimes you need to weigh the greater evil, because you can't be oppressed in your own country, then you're oppressed on the international scene. We need to pick a struggle. You know, sometimes they say that, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So yes, whereas we understand that the problematic situation that we find ourselves in, that then we have to cater to, let me say, Western interests. But as we said, there are some of these values that we have agreed to uphold, and one of them is anti-corruption. You know, one of them is the use of public funds for the good of the people and not to end up in politicians' pockets. So if you have agreed that those are our values on the international scene and as a people, we should be seen to uphold them. The Karamojong also have a right to justice, and perhaps if it's the European powers that are going to give it to them, then isn't that justice in itself? Does it matter who gives you the justice, or it is the end goal at the end of the day that matters? So if the Ugandan criminal system has failed to hold these people accountable for the atrocities they committed against, because there's an atrocity, someone is starving and you're taking the little that was supposed to be for them.
Go to them.
Yeah. So if the criminal system in Uganda cannot hold them accountable, then perhaps the European system should come, because at the global stage we do have an obligation as countries to uphold principles of democracy.
That's right.
We have agreed, right?
All right, I think in the interest of time, I'm going to have to get your last words on this, but the question is, President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni has waxed lyrical many times on the need to fight corruption, and it has become sort of a broken record. Is acting on those that are sanctioned one of his most effective tools to show the world, and Ugandans in particular, that he's intent on rooting corruption out of the country? If I were the president and then I'm like, okay, since somebody has been sanctioned, I think you're not fit to hold office, would that be anything to expect in Uganda? Quickly, as we wrap this up.
True, I think the rhetorics around corruption in the country and what we see on ground are totally
I'm also
different.
trying to make my way around, because I know.
You see the IGG reporting that we lose close to 10 trillion of
Annually.
budget annually towards corruption. And you see the nature of how corruption has since evolved over time, and now we actually institutionalize it and have it within our systems, and it's taking a totally different approach and nature in how many of these practices are being conducted. And so it's very elusive, but I think that as a country we are not very clear in terms of how we address these things, both politically and the institutions that have already been put in place.
Okay.
But I think that the broader picture is that as a country we have to be a bit more serious. We have to be more clear in how we want ourselves to head. Otherwise we'll continue making cases for sovereignty at the point when global players take action against some of the things that they are not happy with.
Honorable, if by any chance we have at least 150 politicians or government officials sanctioned, would that condition or change the actions of any other one politician or who might want to slant towards graft? Is it something that can help us change the arc of history in fighting corruption?
Yes. By the way, that is not the best alternative, but I can tell you it works. The same way the prevalence of ICC, for example, stops many of African leaders from behaving the way they should have behaved. We have had a lot of peace in Kenya because of the manner in which ICC has been lingering its light of impending arrests against leaders. I can tell you we would have had a lot of chaos during the recently concluded elections in Kenya. A lot had been prepared, but nothing took place because ICC keeps, because we have got a substantive principle of jus cogens. as law, in terms of international law. What are the peremptory standards acceptable? It does not matter whether a country, for example, accedes to the Rome Statute. It does not matter. But once your conduct goes beyond the peremptory acceptable standards of human rights respect internationally, you will definitely be arraigned there. So the same way, corruption, I think, when we begin when those that are partnering with us in terms of finance and development begin now to, because what you are seeing is that those that were supposed to apprehend, for me, I don't even know whether anybody is guilty. But I'm saying that the process of apprehension itself becomes lame. When it becomes lame in limine, then you don't expect that the taxpayer, the vulnerable, expects justice at the end of the day. Now, in Uganda, they say, "Bwadene ligambwako nyinirio." So the population begins to think that probably this corruption thing is bigger than the managers of our local scene. Let it be handled by partners away from here. Probably we will see light at the end of the tunnel.
That is an indictment on President Museveni, his inability to handle corruption, and the international community feels that they should be helping him. Many thanks, Honorable Dr. Fred Mukasa Mbidde. Timothy Chemonges, many thanks too. Pleasure. Marion Kirabo, many thanks too. It's been a pleasure, and we are emboldened by your perspectives on these matters. NTV will continue to follow the developments and update us as and when anything becomes available. That will do it for a Kickstarter.